The noise didn't start as noise. It started as habit. The first thing I reached for every morning wasn't water. It wasn't light. It wasn't even a thought. It was my phone. Before my eyes were fully open, my thumb was already scrolling. Notifications, messages, news, stories, other people's lives arriving before my own thoughts had a chance to form. At first, it felt normal. Everyone does it. But somewhere between the endless updates and the carefully filtered smiles, something inside me began to feel tired. Not physically, mentally. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from constant comparison. It doesn't knock you down. It slowly drains you. I would open an app for 5 minutes. 40 minutes would disappear. I told myself I was just checking in. But what I was really doing was measuring. Who got promoted? Who moved cities? Who fell in love? Who bought something new? Who looked happier, fitter, more alive? And quietly, without announcing itself, the question would surface. Am I doing enough? The strange thing is, nothing in my life was actually falling apart. I had work, I had routines, I had people who cared about me. But online, everyone seemed to be accelerating, launching projects, building brands, traveling constantly, living in motion. Meanwhile, I was sitting on my couch, holding a screen, wondering why my life felt paused. The noise wasn't loud in volume, it was loud in comparison. I began noticing subtle shifts in myself. Moments that should have been peaceful felt incomplete without documentation. A good meal became a photo opportunity. A sunset became content. A quiet thought became something I wanted to turn into a caption. Instead of living moments, I was evaluating them. Would this get attention? Would this look meaningful? Would this signal growth? Even when I didn't post, I consumed. Endlessly. There was always something new. Someone smarter. Someone more disciplined. Someone more confident. And each time I closed the app, I felt slightly behind. It's strange how a highlight reel can quietly rewrite your sense of self. You start comparing your entire life to someone else's curated moment. And you lose. Every time. One evening, I realized I had opened the same app 5 separate times within an hour. Not because I had a notification, but because I felt restless. There was a silence in my room that made me uncomfortable. And instead of sitting with it, I reached for noise. Scrolling became a reflex against emptiness. I began sleeping with my phone next to my pillow. If I woke up at 2 a.m., I checked it. If I woke up at 5 a.m., I checked it. It wasn't urgent, it wasn't necessary, but it felt automatic. Like a small dose of dopamine to smooth over the quiet. The more I paid attention, the more I noticed how fragmented my focus had become. Reading a book felt harder. Watching a full movie without checking my phone felt unnatural. Even conversations sometimes competed with the urge to glance at a screen. And yet, from the outside, everything looked fine. I was responsive, connected, up to date. But internally, I felt scattered. Like my attention was no longer fully mine. One afternoon, I caught myself comparing my productivity to someone I barely knew. They had posted about waking up at 5 a.m., high meditating, working out, building a side business. I had woken up at 7:30, rushed through breakfast, and barely made it to work on time. That comparison lingered longer than it should have. It followed me into the evening. It turned into self-criticism. Why can't you be more disciplined? Why are you wasting time? Why are you average? The apps never said those words directly, but they didn't need to. The implication was constant. Everyone is optimizing. What are you doing? I began noticing how often my mood was influenced by what I consumed. A single post could shift my confidence. A single announcement could make my progress feel small. And that frightened me, because it meant my emotional stability was partially outsourced. Outsourced to algorithms, to strangers, to engagement metrics. One night, after an hour of mindless scrolling, I put my phone down and stared at the ceiling. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Without the glow of the screen, the silence felt heavy, uncomfortable. I realized something unsettling. I didn't know how to sit with my own thoughts anymore. The moment stillness appeared, I escaped it. With content. With updates. With noise. But what was I avoiding? That question stayed with me. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention. I noticed how often I reached for my phone during micro moments, waiting in line, waiting for the elevator, waiting for water to boil. Every pause was filled, as if emptiness was dangerous. But emptiness isn't dangerous, it's revealing. And maybe that was the problem. Silence reveals what distraction hides. Fatigue, insecurity, loneliness, unanswered questions. When you're constantly consuming other people's lives, you don't have to examine your own. Scrolling is easier than reflecting. Noise is easier than honesty. One Sunday morning, I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand. I hadn't opened anything yet. For a few seconds, I just held it, and I asked myself something simple. If I didn't open this today, what would happen? The honest answer was nothing. No emergency, no collapse, no disaster, just silence. But that silence felt intimidating, because without the noise, I would be alone with myself. And I wasn't sure I liked that idea. I wasn't sure what I would find. Was I productive enough? Confident enough? Clear about what I wanted? Or had I been using constant updates to avoid those questions? That morning, I didn't delete anything. Not yet. But I felt the first crack in this habit. The first awareness that maybe the noise wasn't neutral. Maybe it was shaping me more than I realized. Maybe it was quietly deciding what mattered, what success looked like, what beauty meant, what progress should feel like. And maybe I had been agreeing without noticing. That realization was unsettling, because it meant the problem wasn't just time wasted, it was identity influenced. Who was I without comparison? Who was I without an audience? Who was I when the screen went dark? The noise had been constant for years, so constant that I mistook it for normal. But normal doesn't always mean healthy, and connection doesn't always mean clarity. That Sunday, I placed my phone face down on the table. The room felt quieter than usual. Or maybe it had always been this quiet. And I was just hearing it for the first time. I didn't know yet that I would delete everything. I didn't know it would become 30 days. All I knew was this. The noise had been shaping my thoughts, and I wanted to hear my own voice again. The first 3 days felt longer than the previous 3 years. Deleting the apps took less than a minute. Holding down the icons, watching them shake, pressing delete. There was no dramatic music, no symbolic moment, just an empty space on my screen where color used to be. For a few seconds, I felt powerful, disciplined, in control. Then the silence arrived. The first morning without social media felt wrong. My hand still reached for my phone the moment I woke up. But there was nothing to open, no notifications, no red dots, no updates waiting, just the lock screen. I stared at it longer than necessary. Then I opened my email instead. Then the news. Then the weather. It wasn't about the apps. It was about the habit of stimulation. I didn't miss specific posts. I missed the feeling of being plugged in. As if by scrolling, I was participating in something larger. Without it, the morning felt slower, quieter, and strangely empty. On the way to work, I noticed how often I would normally fill small gaps with scrolling, waiting at a red light, standing in line for coffee, sitting on the bus. Now there was nothing to do, so I just stood there, and that felt uncomfortable. I became aware of my surroundings in a way that felt almost intrusive. The sound of footsteps, the hum of traffic, the expressions on strangers' faces. It wasn't peaceful yet. It was restless. By the second day, so the urge intensified. My thumb moved automatically to where the apps used to be. Phantom gestures, muscle memory searching for dopamine. It startled me how mechanical it was. I wasn't consciously deciding to check anything, my body was. That realization unsettled me. How many times had I told myself I was in control? But if something so small could pull me so strongly, was I really choosing or reacting? The third day was the hardest, not because I needed information, but because I felt disconnected. What if someone announced something important? What if I missed an opportunity? What if people forgot about me? That last thought surprised me. Forgot about me. I hadn't realized how much of my identity was quietly tied to visibility. Posting meant existing publicly. Liking meant maintaining presence. Commenting meant staying relevant. Without that, I felt invisible, and invisibility felt threatening. In the evening, I caught myself unlocking my phone repeatedly, even though I knew there was nothing new. Each time, I felt a small wave of disappointment. It wasn't about content, it was about validation, the tiny hits of acknowledgement that remind you that you are seen. Without them, the room felt larger, my thoughts louder. I began noticing something else too. Time expanded. Evenings felt longer, not in a boring way, in a raw way. There were minutes that stretched without distraction, moments where I didn't know what to do with myself. So I sat, and in that sitting, emotions surfaced. Subtle ones, a vague dissatisfaction, a quiet loneliness, a lingering question about direction. Normally, I would scroll through someone else's life until those feelings softened. Now they stayed, and I had to face them. On the fourth morning, I woke up instinctively reaching for my phone again. But instead of opening anything, I placed it back down. The room was silent. Sunlight was filtering through the window. I listened to my own breathing. It felt unfamiliar, like I was re-entering a room in my own mind that had been locked for years. By the end of the first week, the intensity shifted. The urges didn't disappear, but they became more visible. I could see them rise and fall, like cravings. I noticed how often boredom triggered the desire to scroll, but boredom, without interruption, started revealing something interesting. Creativity. Ideas that would have been buried under noise began surfacing. Random thoughts. Unfinished plans. Questions about my life that I had postponed. Without constant input, my mind started producing output. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, but it felt like reclaiming territory. Still, the sense of disconnection lingered. At work, colleagues referenced trends or posts I hadn't seen. Conversations moved quickly through online events. I nodded, slightly out of sync. For a moment, I felt behind. Again. The same old comparison. But this time, it wasn't about achievement. It was about awareness. Was I less informed now? Less relevant? The fear of missing out is powerful. It convinces you that absence equals loss. But I began asking myself, what am I actually missing? Viral videos? Filtered updates? Algorithm-selected outrage? Or something deeper? By day 10, something shifted again. The silence stopped feeling hostile. It began feeling spacious. I started walking without headphones, sitting without checking notifications, eating without photographing my meal. Moments felt slower, not optimized, not curated, just lived. There was discomfort, yes, but there was also clarity. I began realizing how often I had shaped my thoughts around potential reactions. How will this sound if I post it? Would people agree? Would this get engagement? Without an audience in mind, my thinking became quieter, more honest. Some thoughts didn't need to be shared. Some experiences didn't need to be documented. They could simply exist. The craving for validation didn't disappear, but it softened, because I started noticing how external feedback had become a mirror I depended on. Without it, I had to form my own reflection. And that was harder, but also more real. One evening, sitting alone without distraction, I felt something unexpected. Sadness, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a low, steady sadness. I realized I had been using noise to avoid this feeling, avoiding unresolved questions about direction, about meaning, about whether I was truly satisfied with where I was. Social media hadn't created these questions, but it had drowned them out. Now they were audible, and facing them felt heavier than any scrolling session ever had. But it also felt necessary, because clarity rarely arrives in noise. It arrives in silence. The first 3 days had felt like withdrawal. The first week felt like disorientation. But somewhere around day 12, something steadier emerged. Presence. Not perfect focus. Not enlightenment. Just presence. And for the first time in a long while, my thoughts felt like they belonged to me again. By the second week, the cravings changed shape. The sharp urgency of the first few days had softened, but something deeper surfaced. Restlessness. It wasn't the loud kind. It was subtle. A quiet itch beneath the surface of ordinary moments. I would sit down to work, and after 20 minutes, my hand would drift toward my phone. There was nothing to open, no apps to check, yet the impulse remained. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't just addicted to content. I was addicted to interruption, the constant switching, the quick stimulation, the small spikes of novelty. Without it, focus felt heavy. Sustained attention felt unnatural. I began noticing how fragmented my mind had become. See, reading a long article required effort. Writing without pausing felt demanding. Even sitting in silence felt like resistance training. And that's when the word finally surfaced. Withdrawal. Not from people, from dopamine, from micro rewards delivered in endless succession. Every scroll had been a tiny promise. Maybe the next post will excite you. Maybe the next update will validate you. Maybe the next video will distract you. Without that loop, my brain felt slower, almost dull. And for a moment, I questioned whether I had made a mistake. Was I overreacting? Was this unnecessary? Everyone else seemed fine. But then I asked myself something more honest. Were they fine, or just constantly stimulated? On day 15, I caught myself unlocking my phone and swiping across the screen where the apps used to be. Again. It was automatic. My thumb searching for something that no longer existed. The gesture itself felt revealing. My body had memorized the path. The loop was physical, and breaking physical habits is harder than breaking intellectual ones. That afternoon, instead of picking up the phone, I stood up and walked outside. No music, no podcast, no input, just air. The first 5 minutes felt awkward. My mind searched for something to consume, but there was nothing to consume, only space. And in that space, thoughts began surfacing, unfiltered, not shaped for an audience, not shortened for captions, raw. Questions about where my life was heading, whether I was satisfied with my work, whether I had been postponing difficult decisions. It dawned on me that distraction had been protecting me. Protecting me from confronting uncertainty. Scrolling was easier than asking, am I happy? Am I aligned? Am I moving intentionally? Without the constant dopamine hits, the emotional baseline shifted. There were dips, moments of boredom that felt almost painful, moments where I felt unproductive without visible output. Because social media had blurred the line between activity and progress. Posting felt like action. Engagement felt like achievement. Now, without those metrics, I had to redefine productivity. What counts if no one sees it? That question lingered, and slowly it reshaped how I worked. Instead of checking reactions, I focused on depth, longer stretches of uninterrupted effort, finishing tasks fully before switching. It felt slower, but more solid. There was also another layer to the withdrawal. Loneliness. Even though I still saw friends in person, even though messages still existed, the absence of constant updates created distance. I no longer knew what everyone was doing at every moment, and that absence felt unsettling, as if connection required constant monitoring. But over time, I realized something subtle. True connection doesn't depend on frequency. It depends on presence. When I met someone for coffee during that third week, I wasn't referencing their latest post. I was asking real questions, and I was listening fully, without the illusion of already knowing. The conversations felt deeper, less performative, more grounded. The noise had previously filled gaps in my day. Now those gaps became reflective pauses. On day 18, I sat alone in my apartment on a quiet evening. No notifications, no scrolling, no external stimulation. And for the first time, I felt a wave of clarity instead of discomfort. My mind wasn't racing. It wasn't craving input. It was simply still, not empty. Still. There is a difference. Emptiness feels hollow. Stillness feels full. In that stillness, I noticed how much of my self-image had been shaped by visibility. How many times had I adjusted my behavior because I imagined it being seen? Even subconsciously, choosing experiences that photograph well, crafting thoughts that sound shareable, evaluating my worth based on engagement. Without that feedback loop, identity felt quieter, more internal, and that was both freeing and frightening, because now there was no applause, no validation, just me. And when you remove the external mirror, you are forced to look inward. The withdrawal phase revealed something important. I hadn't just been consuming content. I had been outsourcing self-assessment, letting algorithms influence what I valued, letting curated lives influence what I pursued, letting engagement metrics influence how I saw myself. Without that constant comparison, my sense of pace changed. I wasn't behind. I wasn't ahead. I simply was. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It arrived gradually, like a fog lifting. I still had moments of craving, moments where I wondered what I was missing. But I also began noticing what I was gaining: longer attention spans, more grounded conversations, less reactive emotions, and perhaps most importantly, a clearer awareness of my own thoughts. By day 20, I understood something that had been hidden beneath the habit. The real challenge wasn't deleting the apps, it was sitting with myself without distraction. Because distraction had been easier than introspection. Noise had been easier than truth. And now, without the noise, I was beginning to hear what I had been avoiding. The questions were no longer drowned out. They were waiting. And this time, I couldn't scroll past them. By the fourth week, something unexpected happened. I stopped counting the days. At first, the challenge had been structured. Day 1 felt dramatic. Day 3 felt restless. Day 15 felt like survival. But somewhere around day 22, the experiment stopped feeling like an experiment. It started feeling like a new baseline. The cravings were quieter now. Not gone, but weaker. Like echoes instead of commands. I no longer reached for my phone every time there was silence. I no longer felt the need to fill every empty space with stimulation. And in that quiet, I began noticing something I hadn't anticipated. Time. Not more hours in the day, but more depth within them. Without the constant interruptions, tasks expanded naturally. Reading wasn't something I fit in. It became immersive. Work didn't feel like fragmented sprints between notifications. It felt continuous. And continuity changes everything. When your mind isn't constantly resetting, it builds momentum. Momentum builds confidence. Confidence builds clarity. I started waking up without immediately checking for updates. There was no rush to see what had happened overnight. Instead, mornings felt slower, deliberate. I would sit with coffee and just think, not plan content, not check reactions, not scan headlines, just think. At first, it felt unproductive, because modern life has trained us to equate speed with value. But slowness has its own intelligence. In slowness, patterns become visible. I noticed how often I used to react emotionally to things that didn't deserve my energy. News cycles engineered for outrage, arguments between strangers, comparisons with people I barely knew. Without exposure to that constant stream, my emotional baseline stabilized. I wasn't riding invisible waves of other people's moods. I wasn't absorbing anxiety that wasn't mine. And that's when another realization surfaced. Social media hadn't just been taking my time. It had been shaping my nervous system. Constant novelty keeps the brain alert. Constant comparison keeps the ego activated. So constant updates keep attention fragmented. Without it, my body felt calmer. There was less urgency, less subtle tension in my chest, less reflexive need to respond. I began noticing physical changes: better sleep, longer focus, fewer impulsive decisions, and something even more subtle. I felt less observed. That might sound strange, but even when you're not actively posting, the awareness of visibility lingers. A background thought: how would this look? Is this worth sharing? Does this measure up? Without platforms, those background calculations disappeared. Experiences became private again, not secret. Private. There's a difference. Privacy creates intimacy with your own life. When everything isn't documented, moments feel heavier, more real. I had dinner with a friend one evening during week 4. No photos, No check-ins, no stories, just conversation. And halfway through, I realized something startling. This moment will exist only in memory, not in archives, not in highlights, not in curated grids, just in memory. And instead of feeling anxious about that, I felt grateful. It meant I was fully there, not splitting my attention between living and recording, not calculating angles, just listening. That sense of presence extended into other areas. When I worked out, I wasn't imagining posting progress. When I read, I wasn't thinking about summarizing it publicly. When I reflected, I wasn't crafting captions in my head. Life became less performative, more internal. And with that shift came another confrontation: identity. Without social media, who was I performing for? For years, even subtle decisions had been influenced by an invisible audience. Career moves, hobbies, opinions, not entirely shaped by it, but subtly adjusted. Now, without feedback loops, the question felt sharper. What do I actually want? Not what sounds impressive, not what looks productive, not what gains approval. What feels aligned? That question is harder than it seems, because when you remove external metrics, there's nothing to measure yourself against. No likes, no comments, no views, only internal resonance. Some days that felt freeing. Other days it felt disorienting, because comparison, while toxic, is predictable. Internal alignment requires honesty, and honesty can be uncomfortable. During week 4, I noticed another shift. My creativity changed. Without constant consumption, my mind had more original thoughts. Not revolutionary ideas, but unborrowed ones. When you're always consuming, your thinking echoes what you've seen. Trends influence tone. Algorithms influence structure. Popular opinions influence expression. Without that constant stream, my thoughts felt slower, but more authentic. I wasn't trying to match a rhythm. I was finding my own. Silence, I realized, is not empty. It's fertile. It gives your mind room to recombine ideas instead of recycling them. By day 26, I no longer felt like I was missing out. That fear had dissolved quietly. If something truly mattered, someone would tell me. If something didn't, it probably didn't deserve my attention. The world continued without my constant observation, and that was humbling. You are not required to witness everything. You are not required to react to everything. You are not required to have an opinion on everything. That understanding brought relief. It narrowed my world in a healthy way. Instead of global noise, I focused on local presence. Instead of endless updates, I focused on immediate reality. The sky outside my window, the tone in someone's voice, the rhythm of my own breath. There was richness there. Subtle, underrated, but real. As day 30 approached, I began asking myself a new question. Not, when can I go back? But, do I even want to go back the same way? Because this wasn't just a detox anymore. It was exposure. Exposure to how easily I had outsourced my attention. Exposure to how subtly my identity had adapted. Exposure to how uncomfortable stillness had once felt. Now stillness felt different, not intimidating, inviting. So I understood something clearly by the end of week 4. Deleting social media didn't remove distraction from the world. It removed it from my pocket. And that small shift had forced a much larger one internally. The noise had faded. The comparison had softened. The urgency had slowed. And in that quieter space, I was beginning to recognize myself again. Not the curated version, not the reactive version, but the unfiltered one. And that recognition changed how I saw the final days ahead. This wasn't about completing a challenge anymore. It was about deciding what kind of relationship I wanted with attention, with validation, and with myself. Day 30 didn't feel dramatic. There was no cinematic sunrise, no sudden enlightenment, no triumphant moment where everything clicked. It felt ordinary. And that's how I knew something had changed. Because in the beginning, I expected transformation to feel explosive. I expected clarity to arrive like a breakthrough. Instead, it arrived quietly, like a room slowly getting brighter as your eyes adjust. On the final morning, I picked up my phone and just held it. No apps installed, no feeds waiting, just a device. And for the first time in years, it felt neutral, not magnetic, not demanding, neutral. That neutrality was powerful because it meant the pull had weakened. 30 days earlier, I had deleted social media out of frustration. Frustration with distraction, frustration with comparison, frustration with the subtle anxiety that followed me everywhere. But somewhere along the way, the experiment stopped being about social media. It became about attention, about presence, about identity. What I discovered wasn't that social media is evil. It's not. It connects. It informs. It entertains. But it amplifies. And if you don't control it, it controls you. It amplifies comparison. It amplifies outrage. It amplifies insecurity. It amplifies ego. And it amplifies distraction. The real question isn't whether social media is good or bad. The real question is, are you using it consciously? Or are you being used by it? Before this experiment, I didn't think I was addicted. I thought I was just staying updated, just taking breaks, just keeping up. But those small justifications stacked up into hours, into fractured focus, into emotional noise that didn't belong to me. When I removed the apps, I didn't just remove content. I removed constant stimulation. And in that absence, I faced something uncomfortable: myself, my boredom, my insecurities, my unfinished thoughts, my unmade decisions. Scrolling had been a convenient escape hatch. Feeling uncertain? Scroll, feeling lonely? Scroll, feeling overwhelmed? Scroll. It was reflexive, instant relief. But relief is not resolution. During those 30 days, I had to sit with discomfort long enough for it to speak. And when discomfort speaks, it doesn't shout. It whispers. It asks questions like, why are you restless? Why are you avoiding that conversation? Why are you chasing validation? Why are you afraid of being unseen? Those questions don't trend. They don't go viral. But they change you. I also learned something about loneliness. At first, I thought I would feel disconnected. But what I felt instead was selective connection. I reached out intentionally. I met people deliberately. I spoke without multitasking. And those interactions felt heavier, more real, because they weren't layered on top of constant passive updates. There is a difference between knowing what someone posted and knowing how they actually feel. There is a difference between consuming someone's life and participating in your own. Without social media, I had fewer inputs, but I had more depth, fewer opinions in my head, more clarity in my thoughts. I slept better. I focused longer. I reacted less impulsively. But the most surprising shift wasn't behavioral, it was psychological. My sense of self felt less performative. For years, even when I wasn't posting, I had been subtly curating, thinking in captions, framing moments, measuring experiences against visibility. Without that invisible audience, something relaxed. I didn't need moments to be impressive. They just needed to be real. And real is quieter than impressive. Real doesn't need filters. Real doesn't need metrics. Real doesn't ask to be validated. It just exists. On day 30, I asked myself a final question. Will I reinstall the apps? The honest answer was yes. But not the same way. Not with notifications on. Not with mindless scrolling. Not with unconscious reflexes. The experiment wasn't about permanent exile. It was about awareness. Now I know what constant stimulation feels like, and I know what silence feels like. And once you experience both, you can't pretend you don't notice the difference. I don't want to return to unconscious consumption. I don't want my attention fragmented by default. I don't want my worth influenced by numbers on a screen, because attention is finite, and where you place it shapes who you become. If you spend hours observing other people's lives, your own life shrinks in proportion. If you measure yourself constantly, you forget how to simply be. Deleting social media for 30 days didn't fix my life. It didn't solve every insecurity. It didn't answer every question. But it did something more important. It gave me distance. And distance creates perspective. Perspective reveals patterns, and patterns reveal truth. The truth for me was simple. I don't need to witness everything. I don't need to react to everything. I don't need to share everything. Some parts of life are better lived privately. Some thoughts are better developed slowly. Some growth happens off camera. And maybe the most important lesson of all, silence is not emptiness. It is space. And in that space, you meet yourself. Not the version shaped by algorithms, not the version polished for approval, but the version that exists when no one is watching. If you're constantly distracted, if your mind feels fragmented, if you feel slightly restless even when nothing is wrong, maybe it's not you. Maybe it's the noise. Maybe what you need isn't more content. Maybe what you need is space. I'm not telling you to delete everything. I'm not telling you to disappear. But I am asking you to notice. Notice how often you reach for your phone without thinking. Notice how your mood shifts after scrolling. Notice how much of your day is spent observing instead of living. Awareness is the first reset. And if you ever feel brave enough, try stepping away. Even for a week. Even for a few days. Not to escape the world, but to return to yourself. Because on the other side of constant stimulation, there is something quieter, something steadier, something real, and it's been waiting for you. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this resonated with you, share your thoughts below. And if you want more reflections like this, slow, honest, and intentional, subscribe and stay connected. Sometimes the most powerful changes start in silence. When I finally reinstalled the apps, nothing dramatic happened. No fireworks, no rush of dopamine, no overwhelming flood of emotion, just icons reappearing on a screen. But this time, something was different. I didn't open them immediately. I just looked at them. And I realized the experiment had already done its work. Because the power dynamic had shifted. Before, the apps felt like gravity. Now they felt like tools. Optional. That distinction matters. When something feels necessary, it owns you. When something feels optional, you own it. I opened one platform briefly, scrolled for less than 2 minutes, and felt it instantly. The speed, the noise, the subtle pull to keep going. It wasn't evil. It was engineered. Endless content, endless novelty, endless opportunity to compare. And because I had spent 30 days in silence, the contrast was sharp. What once felt normal now felt intense. What once felt harmless now felt heavy. That awareness didn't make me reject it entirely. It made me intentional. I turned off notifications. All of them. No badges, no buzzes, no red circles demanding attention. If I open an app now, it's because I decided to, not because it summoned me. That small change altered everything. Because attention is not just time, it is energy. And energy directed unconsciously drains you. Energy directed consciously builds you. The 30-day break revealed something deeper than distraction. It revealed dependency on stimulation. We live in a world where silence feels uncomfortable, where boredom feels like failure, where being offline feels like disappearing. But I learned something simple and powerful. You do not disappear when you are unseen. You become grounded. There is strength in anonymity. There is clarity in privacy. There is confidence in not needing to broadcast every thought. For years, I believed staying constantly connected meant staying relevant. But relevance to who? Strangers? Algorithms? Metrics? Yeah, the truth is, the people who truly matter don't measure you in likes. They measure you in presence, in consistency, in depth. And depth requires focus. Focus requires boundaries. Boundaries require awareness. Without the break, I wouldn't have seen how porous my boundaries were, how easily my mood could be influenced by something trivial, how easily my attention could be redirected, how easily comparison could creep in. Comparison is subtle. It rarely screams. It whispers, "You're behind. You're not enough. You should be doing more." But those whispers grow louder the more you consume curated lives. Stepping away muted them, not completely, but enough to hear my own voice again. And when your own voice becomes clearer, decisions become simpler. You stop chasing everything. You start choosing selectively. You stop reacting impulsively. You start responding intentionally. The most surprising part of this journey wasn't productivity. It wasn't better sleep. It wasn't even improved focus. It was peace. A quiet, steady peace. The kind that doesn't spike. The kind that doesn't depend on external validation. The kind that stays even when nothing exciting is happening. Because real life isn't a highlight reel. Most of it is ordinary. Waking up, working, eating, talking, resting. And when you stop comparing your ordinary to someone else's curated extraordinary, you begin to appreciate it. I started noticing small details again. The way light moves across the room in the afternoon. The rhythm of my own breathing when I'm calm. The subtle satisfaction of completing something without announcing it. These things don't trend, but they anchor you. We often think transformation requires massive change, but sometimes it requires subtraction, removing noise, removing stimulation, removing the constant mirror of comparison. And in that subtraction, you rediscover proportion. You realize the world does not collapse when you log off. You realize news finds you if it matters. You realize friendships survive without constant monitoring. You realize your worth was never tied to metrics. The break didn't make me anti-social media. It made me aware of its weight. Now I treat it like sugar, enjoyable, occasional, but not foundational. Because if something is engineered to capture your attention, you must be intentional about protecting it. Your attention shapes your thoughts. Your thoughts shape your actions. Your actions shape your life. And if your attention is constantly fragmented, your life will feel fragmented. The 30 days forced me to confront that. It forced me to sit in silence long enough to understand myself without distraction. And that is uncomfortable, but necessary. If you've been feeling scattered, restless, slightly dissatisfied without knowing why, maybe you don't need a new routine. Maybe you don't need more motivation. Maybe you just need space. Space to think without input. Space to feel without distraction. Space to hear your own questions clearly. Because once you do, you stop outsourcing your sense of self. You stop measuring your life through a screen. You start living it from within. This wasn't a productivity hack. It wasn't a self-improvement trend. It was a confrontation with habit, with ego, with avoidance. And on the other side of that confrontation, I didn't find perfection. I found clarity. And clarity is quieter than hype, but infinitely more powerful. If you've watched this entire journey, thank you, truly. Your time is valuable, and choosing to spend it here, reflecting, thinking, questioning, means more than you realize. If this series resonated with you, if it challenged you, or if it simply made you pause, let me know. And if you want more honest conversations about attention, growth, and intentional living, subscribe and stay with me. Sometimes the most important changes don't happen loudly. They happen the moment you decide to take your attention back.